1. To set the tone, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college and quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings in broad daylight, robberies, you name it. Well, for the first 3 years I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't awful, but it was sketchy. So when I was making decent enough money, I moved out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet if that. Super old and poorly built. It was just me living there, so I didn't mind how small it was. But what originally sold me was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and some wooded areas with only a few houses nearby. Considering I hated being in the town due to the continuous paranoia of getting mugged or shot, I loved the idea of living out there. So at the beginning of July I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. A month goes by, and everything is still swell to me, and I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place, and spent long amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. Important later. Roughly 2 months into living there, I started to notice things out of place. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself, so he had a key but was never there. He just kinda popped in once every other week to grab something, and usually let me know beforehand. But I'd come home to my kitchen chair being pulled away from my table, or a bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small things that I wrote it off as my roommate, swinging by, or just stuff I was forgetting. But then my dog developed this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He'd just lay there on the couch and chew his toys. He never barked, never did anything weird. However, all of a sudden he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He'd literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and wouldn't stop until I came back into the house. He didn't want me to leave him there alone. At all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, not yet. So I decided one day I'd put a movie in for him while I was out. Thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task up at work, and knew I'd be home early, so I put in a copy of Hamlet. I know, boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long. I knew it would be playing when I came back. Flash forward 3 hours, long before Hamlet should have been over, but when I walked in the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and the Xbox were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him, and he shrugged it off as the TV powering off when it idles for a while. Even though this is true, there are several reasons why I know this isn't the case. 1, it wasn't idling. A 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. 2, even if it had shut off, my Xbox wouldn't have. I have left it on by accident for weeks. I was gone out of town or whatever. And it was still on when I came home. Always. But it was completely powered down this time. The weird thing is, none of my stuff was missing, and the door was locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself that it was something weird with the Xbox, or whatever, and shrugged it off. That is until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier when I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she even walked by the house while he was out, he'd start yelping and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me, and made me incredibly cautious of her. I put some cheap alarms on my doors, the kind that go off when the door is opened, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night the alarms were on my doors, I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. But once I got to the door, it was shut, and there was nobody there. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room. The door would have had to been opened for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and landed there. Something else weird, the door was locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police couldn't do much as I had no witnesses, no lead, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the locks. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that, but later found out that the close neighbor that my dog hated had previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I have no way to prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key, and was coming and going as she pleased. Why though, I can't figure out. Nothing of mine ever went missing. The most unsettling part for me, though, is that she tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times has she been in my house at night while I slept? And why? I thankfully no longer live there. 2. This was 10 years ago, just after my parents divorced, and were in the process of selling my childhood home. My mom had moved across town, and my dad, who traveled for a living, was gone for long stretches of time, leaving my older brother and I alone often. As teenagers, we didn't mind. Even with this upheaval at home, our lives were fairly routine. Both of us worked and were in school, so we left and got home at the same times each day. At night, we'd go to the gym just outside of our neighborhood for a couple of hours. My brother's friend, James, would join us. One night, James, my brother, and another one of their friends, Christopher, were hanging out at our house, washing their cars in preparation for the weekend. Since it was dark, my brother had borrowed my car keys to illuminate the driveway with my headlights so they could see. When they were finished, my brother asked me if I felt like going to the gym with them, and I declined. I wasn't feeling up to it, so they left me home alone. Before I went upstairs to my bedroom to blare music now the house was empty, I noticed that the front door was unlocked, and the back door was locked. This detail didn't particularly alarm me, because we lived in a safe neighborhood, centered by golf courses and a country club. In other words, I had nothing to worry about. I went to my room and listened to loud music for about half an hour with my door shut. Then, hungry, I went downstairs to fix myself something to eat. That's when I noticed the front door was locked. I wasn't too concerned at this point. Perhaps I had locked it before I went upstairs. I didn't remember locking it, but it was the most rational explanation. Then I noticed the back door was unlocked. I definitely didn't unlock the back door. As irrational then as it seemed, it hit me with a jolt. Somebody was in our house. My brother had left my car keys on the counter in the kitchen. I grabbed them and ran out the front door to my car. I put the keys in the ignition and it didn't start. My brother had left the lights on. The battery was dead. Motherfucker! It was like being in a horror movie. Frantic, I called my brother. Since he had his headphones plugged into his phone, listening to music while he worked out, he was forced to answer. I think somebody is or was in our house, I said. I told him about the front door and how I didn't lock it. So either somebody was in our house or in the backyard. Can you please come home? As I said this, a man with a miniature baseball bat comes from the side yard of our house. His pace was quick, as if he didn't want to be seen, but it slowed once he reached the road, where he walked normally, as if nothing had happened. I told my brother what I just saw. "I recognize him," I said. "It's our neighbor." My brother and his friends came rushing home about 10 minutes later. I repeated the story. "Okay," my brother, a hothead, said. "We're going over to his house." I sat back at home after the four of us had checked every room in the house with my dad's gun. It was clear. No one was there. When they came back, they told me that they'd knocked on the front door and an older woman had answered. "The look on her face," James said later, "was like she'd been expecting us." And that's when her middle-aged son, the guy with the bat, came down. Before we even spoke, he yelled out, "I didn't break into anybody's house!" "We never said that," my brother had said. "We just wanted to tell you that somebody was in our house just now." The mother had taken on a protective, though somewhat submissive stance. "Listen, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. I promise it." My brother and his friends saw in her eyes that she knew they were telling the truth. That her son wasn't. "It better not," my brother had said, looking up at her son behind her. When they got home, they recounted this story for me, and we began to dissect what had happened. We'd seen this man before. He was older, late 30s, early 40s, and lived with his elderly parents. He only seemed to come out at night. But he would go on long walks around the neighborhood muttering to himself, carrying a miniature baseball bat to fend off dogs, as he had been overheard telling a neighbor. He obviously had mental problems of some kind, and he'd obviously been watching our house. He knew our routine. We determined that he may have mistaken my brother's friend Christopher for me, and thinking the house empty, entered through the unlocked front door. When he realized that I was home, he then left through the back door, and had hidden in the backyard until he thought the coast was clear. How long he'd been inside we weren't sure, but I'd been in my room for at least half an hour. Why he was breaking into our house we didn't know, but we guessed it wasn't the first time he'd done something like this, and it may have been the overactive and speculative imaginations of a bunch of teenagers. But we guessed he did it because running around someone's empty house, unbeknownst to them, gave him some kind of sick thrill. Perhaps stalking people gave him something to do, and it was clear to us that he probably couldn't help himself, that he'd probably do it again. 3. When I was growing up, my dad was a single parent who worked long hours, and all his family lived back in Ireland. As a result, during the summer holidays, my brother and I were pretty much left to our own devices, even when I was 7 and he was 13. This got us into a few scrapes down the years, but one that really freaks me out is Greaves Hall. If I remember correctly, Greaves Hall used to be an asylum, but has been burned down a few times and lain derelict for the last few decades. It was also one of very few points of interest in Banks, during the short period of time in which we lived there. Last I saw of it, they were building a new housing estate there, so hopefully they've pulled it down. But I've not been to Banks for years. It's shit. As I'm sure you'd expect, the site has a reputation as being haunted. Anyway, one day, when England was experiencing its annual 2 weeks of summer, my brother and his mates decided to go down to Greaves Hall. Nominally, it was to kick a football about, but we all knew that they were really going there to stare at the ruin, and make up some arbitrary reason for why they all bitched out of going in. Being the bratty little sister, I was kind enough to point this out. Unfortunately, Big Bro was also a twatty older brother, and basically called my bluff after I'd spent several minutes calling them fannies. So, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, I set off with them. We stopped by the corner shop for some 90s approved levels of sugary snack food, and one of my brother's mates slipped the guy some cash for 2 massive bottles of White Lightning and some fags. This made me very excited, because I was convinced I was going to get drunk and become really good at pool. My dad used to tell me stories of how he'd win pool games when he'd had a few pints. In hindsight, the stories were very similar to Popeye, but with rampant alcoholism instead of spinach. So we walked to the hall, my brother, his 5 friends, and me tagging along at the back. I tried to be involved in the conversation, but they maintained it was for adults only. And we went on talking about Shira's boobs. I think they were starting to regret bringing me. Things settled down once we got onto the grounds. We had a 30-minute kickabout, during which I bagged a hat trick. In hindsight, entirely due to my brother's threat to batter anyone who tried to tackle me, and nearly Ravanelli'd right into a tree. After the game, we poked around the grounds. There's loads of outbuildings around the main hall in various states of disrepair. One of my brother's friends got very interested in a tag someone had left on one of the walls of what looked like a barn or a depot or something. It was hard to tell what its original purpose had been. We stopped by the water tower, where Big Bro managed to hook a used condom on the end of a stick and chase everyone around with it. Next came an E-number and alcohol-laden lunch. I wasn't allowed any of the booze, so no sick pool skills were acquired. And then, just as the heat of the day passed, we found ourselves with nothing left to do but head to the main hall. "Go on then," Big Bro said, nodding towards the building. "After you," I replied, proud of myself. I'd been working on that one all afternoon. Having mugged Big Bro right off, I let him lead the way with a shamble to his steps and Dutch courage in his heart. The rest of us filed in behind. To be honest, the hall itself was disappointing. It looks very scary from the outside, crumbling away and fire-damaged, with foliage overgrowing the outside of the building. Most of the windows were long smashed, leaving these gaping black spaces even on a sunny day. Inside, though, it was just a building. Kind of like any building that age. You could tell it had been grand once. But now the paint was crumbling, the floors peeling up. My brother and friends got bored of poking around the ground floor quickly. They went up the rotten staircase one at a time, but I was confined to the ground floor. This might sound like my brother being protective, but he's used me to test similar staircases in the past, so I think he just wanted rid of me. Anyway, my dad always bollocks me if I don't do as Big Bro says, so I kicked my heels downstairs for a while. There was a big room which I think might have been the canteen once, but even now you could tell it had been posh. Tile floors and such, so I passed some time twirling around pretending to be a ballerina. The others must have found something, because they were gone a while. So eventually I got bored and went back to exploring. I was just investigating a particularly gnarly-looking black fungus growing out of the walls, when I saw that one of the doors that was either locked or swollen shut had a hole in it, just wide enough for a scrawny 7-year-old. With the minimum of grunting and no concept of the tetanus risk I was running, I managed to scrape my way past the door into a mouldy-smelling room, with a sluice and a load of cleaning equipment. There were a lot of brown pellets on the floor, which I now realize were rat droppings. Ugh. The ceiling was partly collapsed in one corner as well, so I naturally decided I would be totally safe to climb onto an old basin, then a locker, and scramble up the wall until I could pull myself onto the next floor. I was quite pleased with myself at this point, lying on the damp floorboards in a room that was empty other than an overturned bed. I pretty much jumped straight up when I heard my brother and his friends laughing, already hatching plans of how I could fuck with them in this haunted asylum. Then I saw something outside the window. There was a man dressed in a black overcoat and a hat, standing just inside the tree line of the woods. Hard to judge heights when you're a runty little girl standing on the first floor, but he looked well over 6 feet tall and wide, I remember that vividly. He wasn't fat, per se, but he was incredibly broad-shouldered. Looking back, I assume he was a homeless guy or something. But he looked neater than a homeless man, and his posture didn't strike me as that of someone living on the street. He stood up straight, staring through the empty window into the room, where I could hear my brother and his friends laughing. Being chronically thick, I pretty much ignored this dude, under the cast-iron logic that he wasn't supposed to be here, because if he was, he'd be wearing a high-vis jacket. I went back to looking around the room. That's when I saw the stuff. It had been hidden when I was on the floor, behind the rusted bed frame, but now as I walked over to it, I saw and smelled the signs of someone living there. There was a sleeping bag that smelled bad enough to make me gag, a few scraps of newspaper, a tow rope, a tangled heap of clothes, and beside it all, a big, mean-looking fucker of a knife. I remember pondering to myself whether it was a sword or a knife at that size, and looking back, I think the blade must have been a good 18 inches. It was covered in a black oily substance, and what looked like crusted blood. I was reaching down to pick it up, because no sense of self-preservation. When I remembered the dude in the tree line, I froze, doing the arithmetic needed to work out just how thoroughly fucked I might be. That sort of turned into a paralysis of indecision, and fear that rooted me to the spot for a full minute. Then I heard the sound of feet scraping against stone at the bottom of the window by my head. As is my default response, I turned tail and ran out of the room, along a molded hallway, and into the room where my brother was. "I want to go home," I managed to mumble. "How did you get up here?" He was going to take too long to agree, I knew it, if I told him about the man. And at that point I was absolutely convinced that this big bear of a guy was going to come and gut us with his knife any minute. I tried a different tact. "I want to go home. Now," looking down at my feet. It was a look I'd perfected after years of asking to sleep in his bed if we'd watched a scary film. "Who's the funny now, Sam?" My brother's fat friend, who we'll refer to as Heinous Bellend, said. "Belltop, she's just a kid," Big Bro replied. Normally I'd have gone into full brat mode at that comment, but I was desperate to leave, so I let it slide. I pretty much dragged them out of the place, even if Heinous Bellend took his sweet time getting down the stairs. As we got outside, I grabbed the bottle of White Lightning from Big Bro and took off towards the entrance, boasting about how I was going to give it to Dad. It had the desired effect of getting them all to leave as fast as their legs could carry them. I tried not to look back, because I knew I'd piss my pants if I saw the man. But as we rounded the corner leading back to the street, I couldn't help myself. Truthfully, I don't know if I saw him. All I saw was that big scary building with its pitch-black windows. He could have been in any one of them. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 238. Thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Okay, first a few things I want to address. I've been getting lots of encouraging messages recently, which are super awesome to get, but I'm getting the impression that some of you think I'm leaving YouTube. I just want to reassure you all that I'm not leaving, okay? I am actually going to build up and expand a bit. I've got a Twitch channel. I haven't used it much yet, but I've been looking into the requirements to get it up and running so that I could actually add it to something that I can use to help make a living. And it doesn't look too bad, so I'll have to build up a fan base over there. And when I'm ready to do it, I'll include little links to when I'm streaming over there and so on. And I hope you guys like Sherlock Holmes and Batman games. That's mostly what I play, but I'm certainly open to playing other things if they're interesting. Absolutely. I believe there's a Friday the 13th game out. I'm not really sure how I feel about playing that. I don't really tend to enjoy games where you play the villain. Although I do completely and totally love those films in every way, so that might sound a bit weird. Probably more enjoyable to watch it than it is to actually do it. That might be my thinking there. Although I do have others. Hang on, let me load up Steam here. What else have I got? Well, I've got a load of Telltale games. Back to the Future. I got the first Batman one. I haven't got the new one. I'll want to play through the first one first. And Injustice. Well, it's just a fighting game, really. Ghostbusters 2009. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. So many Sherlock Holmes games. Life is Strange. And a bunch of the Lego games like the Batman, Harry Potter, I've got them. And yeah, and so on and so on. So I've certainly got a bunch to choose from there, but I'd be open to purchasing something else if there's an interest in it, if there's a demand for it. But we'll see. So if you have any suggestions, by all means, please do let me know, and I'll consider it for getting things up and running. Okay, so until next time, I'm gonna head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.